We're talking about focus today with the Fujifilm X-T5, and obviously the same idea and concept will work for all the other Fujifilm cameras. So let's go ahead and start with my favorite way to focus. I've been using Fujifilm like this since the X-T2, and that is using back button focus while in manual mode. I'm pretty sure many of you have heard of back button focus before or have been using back button focus since like forever because there are lots of benefits from using it. But in case if you're not familiar with it, one of the benefits is that the camera will lock the focus when you use one of the button back here as AF on. This way, no matter what moves between the subject and the camera, when you press the shutter, it's not going to focus on that new object in front of it or in between the camera and the subject. It'll still be locked onto the subject. Personally, I really do like where the AF on button is at here on the X-T5, and the name of the button is already AF on. Unlike the X-T2 that I had before, I believe it was like AEL. There wasn't an AF on button, and the same goes to X-T3. I think they might have changed it and put the AF on button on the X-T4, so that's why it's on the X-T5, because the button layout is pretty much the same. But either way, if you do want to change the AF on button, all you have to do is long press the back button over here, and you can quickly adjust any of the back buttons over here to AF on. So what I mean earlier by saying that I like to use back button focus in manual mode is so that whenever I'm in manual mode, the back button focus with the AF on will act kind of like autofocus already. So right now I have focus peak on. You can see where I have adjusted the focus, and if I need to fine-tune my focus manually, I can do so within manual mode. But at the same time, if I want to go back to like autofocus, I can readjust and press the AF on, which is the back button focus here. It'll focus on a new subject just like autofocus. And because we're inside manual mode, when you have pressed the shutter, it's not going to refocus again. It'll just take the photo. Now on top of that, using the same idea and concept, I can do the same thing or quite similarly with the autofocus continuous, which is the AFC here on the mode selector dial here. Again, I'm still inside manual mode, so basically I can access continuous autofocus as well as single autofocus all within manual mode without having to change the mode dial here. But first, you'll have to change the instant autofocus setting inside the AF/MF menu to autofocus continuous. So basically what's happening here is that I'm inside manual mode, and whenever I press the autofocus on the back button focus once, and it's gonna act like a single autofocus where it locks on the subject and it's not gonna change focus in between. But if I want to access continuous autofocus, I don't have to switch dials here. I don't have to change mode. I can still stay within manual mode. But all I have to do is to press autofocus on and just kind of like hold it, and it'll act like a continuous autofocus. This way I can stay inside manual mode and still be able to access single autofocus, continuous autofocus, as well as manual focus. And this is like my favorite way to focus. And because we never decouple the autofocus on the shutter, so whenever you want someone else to take a photo of you, all you have to do is to switch to autofocus single on the mode dial here, and then make sure that you turn on face detection, and then simply give the camera to the person who wants to take the photo of you, like I did in the last portrait video I made. And right away they can just half press the shutter and then take the photo with the same button over here. Especially with the great face detection that Fujifilm X-T5 has, it basically doesn't miss on your face. Now let's dive into the menu here. There are a couple of settings that I like to change just to make the focus on the Fujifilm more seamless. So let's start with the autofocus orientation to focus area only. So it remembers where you had the focus point at, especially when you're shooting portrait. Basically, the focus area for each orientation can be selected separately. And I also like to set the autofocus point display to off. This way they're not like everywhere on the screen. I only want to know whenever I'm changing the focus point, and that's totally fine. But after that, I don't really need to have them on there all the time. And while we are on the topic of focus point here, I will also turn on the the wrap focus point. Basically, it allows the focus point to travel infinitely whenever you are at the far left or the far right. This way, if I'm using the joystick at the back to control the focus point, I don't have to adjust the focus point back and forth in between the frame. I also always keep the focus point to 425 points, so I have more options, and in a way, this is more precise. Now, one reason to use 117 points is so that it's quicker and faster to navigate points around. But here's a trick that I do to navigate focus point faster, and that is to use touch area or touch autofocus to change focus point. The difference between touch area and touch autofocus is that with touch autofocus, you can tap on the screen and the autofocus point will change accordingly and focus the shot at the same time. With touch area, you can tap the screen to change autofocus point, but it doesn't focus for you. You'll still have to use either back button focus or half press the shutter, or really whichever way you like to focus. Personally, I like to use touch area more so I can use back button focus to lock on the subject. And on top of that, whenever I'm using touch area, you can also navigate the focus point by dragging your finger on the screen while you're using the EVF, and you can change whichever part of the screen that you feel more comfortable dragging the focus point with. I like using it with the right part of the screen to adjust focus point while using the EVF. That's where my thumb feels most comfortable while I'm dragging the autofocus point on the screen. But if you like to use your left thumb, that's also doable if you want to do that. Now, it's not very smooth, but it is faster than changing the focus around while using the joystick when I'm using an EVF. And whenever I need, I can always tap, like press the joystick once to recenter the focus point. Here's something that I would turn off, and that is the pre-autofocus. Having pre-autofocus on, the camera will always try to autofocus whenever you're not using the camera or controlling the camera, and it does strain battery, so usually I just have it off to save battery. I also have the autofocus illuminator off, so no one in front of me knows that I'm taking photos of them, especially street photography. But if you're doing a wedding or an event where people knows that you're taking photos of them, you can always turn it on to have more successful autofocus, especially in low light conditions. This next setting here, the autofocus plus manual focus, I usually have it on and didn't really think twice about it, but now I turn it off. But basically what it does is that whenever I'm in autofocus, I can use autofocus, but if I have press kind of like the shutter, and I can also adjust the focus manually at the same time. And this works great, especially when you're taking photos of like reflections or silhouette photos. But during a recent shoot, I noticed that if I have the autofocus plus manual focus turned on, the focus priority won't work. So now I just have it turned off all the time now. And honestly, for me, it's not that big of a deal because I'm shooting manual mode anyways, like I mentioned earlier in the beginning of the video. So if I really want to manually adjust the focus, I just turn the manual focus ring whenever I need to. Under manual focus assist, with focus peak, I usually use focus peak highlight, and over here I use red in high because I feel like the low it just doesn't really show up that much. It's not that obvious whenever I'm looking at the EVF or the LCD screen. And if I really need to check, I can always press the command dial back here. It'll punch in to where the focus point is at, so I can double check on the focus. And similarly, you can also use focus check for that. So whenever you turn the focus ring, it'll punch in automatically to where you're trying to focus. However, I find it kind of cumbersome whenever I'm using this because I'd rather just to like punch in whenever I need to instead of like adjusting the focus ring, the manual focus ring here, because I don't need the function all the time. And on top of that, whenever I accidentally turn the focus ring, it'll activate it right away. So I'm not a big fan of this function, that's why I have it turned it off. And with autofocus custom setting, I have set it to 2, so it avoids obstacles that comes in front of your subject. This really depends on what type of photography that you're doing, so it's really like a personal preference, but usually I just set it in 2, like most of the time. So that's pretty much all of the settings that I use on the Fujifilm X-T5 regarding to focus. If you like video regarding to Fujifilm, definitely check this one out next. With that being said, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one.